Welcome to our Natural Habitat Adventures presentation today, Understanding the Amazing Monarch Butterfly Migration by Court Whelan, Ph.D. Court was born and raised in Florida and spent much of his youth outdoors fostering a strong love and appreciation for nature and wildlife. And this fascination led him to attend the University of Florida, where he received a bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in both ecotourism and entomology. Today, Court guides the world's best nature expeditions with Natural Habitat Adventures, while also heading up NatHab's sustainability efforts, elevating it to become one of the most sustainable and eco-conscious travel enterprises in the world. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Court Whelan. Court, welcome.
Lee, thank you so much, and welcome to everybody out there in the NatHab family, the NatHab community. Gosh, nowadays the sense of community is more important than ever, and I wanted to share a really cool statistic with you that I just learned from Lee and Kendall is that we have about 1,073 people that have RSVP'd for this webinar, which is absolutely amazing. It sets quite a big record here at Natural Habitat. So thank you so much for tuning in and joining me on quite literally one of my favorite topics to talk about in the world, and that's monarch butterflies. If you got the invitation, got the email, you know it's something that's been very near and dear to my heart. I've been personally guiding expeditions to see this for the last 17, 18 years. It's been a core part of my master's and PhD work. And it's just something that I find pretty darn fascinating. So again, a pleasure to be in front of all you guys digitally out there, wherever in the world you're calling in from. And let's go ahead and get started. So again, this is a little bit of a different webinar than we're doing normally here at NatHab. Oftentimes we're talking about a specific trip. Even though we do trips here, what we're really doing, we were talking about science. This is kind of a learning experience. So I think we probably have a much broader audience than usual, and that's certainly a privilege and a pleasure to be in front of. So again, buckle up. We've got a cool presentation here, and we're going to learn about the monarch butterfly and its amazing migration. So just to get things started, put a face to the name, here's yours truly with a couple of my best friends here in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. This is a few years back, but yes, so I'm an expedition leader, as Lee mentioned, with Natural Habitat expedition leader. So I guide a lot of trips. So I view myself as an explorer, an educator, pioneer in a few ways, but I do like to explore all sorts of parts of the world in my free time. I'm also a photographer as well, and you're going to see a lot of photos that I've taken over the years today. And I photograph things all the way from small chameleons in Madagascar to some of the most charismatic megafauna in the world with wild dogs in Africa. And it's quite literally from pole to pole. Here in the North Pole, all the way down to the south with some of my feathered friends and penguin buddies. But I digress. What we're really here to talk about today is the amazing monarch butterfly. This is going to be the subject of our talk today. So yeah, this little critter, how can we possibly fill an entire hour? Well, really, I could probably fill several years of talking about this guy because of what they do. You know, all insects are cool. I am an entomologist, so I have quite a fondness to anything that flutters and crawls around. I think they're just amazing creatures, but I'm particularly drawn to this one because of this amazing migratory phenomenon. And this is what we're going to be talking about and learning about today. This clustering behavior, this gregarious behavior, this ability to migrate literally up to 3,000 miles in one direction, increase their lifespan by fourfold, aggregate in these beautiful colonies and put on really one of the most amazing shows that you can see as a nature lover, as a naturalist, as a biologist, or just anybody that appreciates the outdoors. It's a pretty miraculous phenomenon, and of course showing a few photos here of really what the magic's all about. But gosh, I could just go on and on with the amazing photos, but we'll certainly get into some biology here. So, what they're doing down here is they're obviously overwintering. You'll hear a few different terms and phrases out there about what are they doing. Are they hibernating? Are they overwintering? So, scientists will call it a diapause, a quasi-hibernation, quiescence. These all pretty much mean the same thing. So I'll probably use those terms interchangeably. But because this is a pretty broad topic, I kind of broke the presentation into a few different questions. So the first one we're going to start off with for the next few slides, the next few minutes is, well, why do they migrate? Okay, we have 1.5 million species of identified insects over the face of the planet, and the vast, vast, vast majority do not migrate. Why does this one happen to migrate? Well, let me tell you the story behind that. So basically, the monarch butterfly is a tropical butterfly to begin with in its history. So very akin to like a blue morpho that you see on the screen here. It is a tropical butterfly. It may be not too surprising because it is pretty showy. It's beautiful. It's a large butterfly. It does look like a tropical butterfly in some ways. Um, Butterflies, this is going to be by far the most complicated slide you see, so don't read too far into it. But butterflies in general, they've been on the earth for about the last 40 to 50 million years. They're related to moths. Moths are the ancestors that have been around for anywhere from 100 to 160 million years. But right around the time that flowering plants emerged on our planet, which is about 50 to 60 million years ago, right at the end of the Cretaceous, right at the end of the dinosaurs, this big change up in the ecosystems and biota, flora and fauna of the world. That blank canvas after the dinosaurs allowed for flowering plants to emerge. And as you think of a butterfly as one of the most prolific and famous pollinators out there, they emerged very shortly after. They are very obligate to flowers. So the monarch butterfly, we don't know exactly how old the monarch butterfly is, but we know, we know individual butterflies are just a couple weeks or a couple months, but in terms of a species, we know that its family group, the nymphalid butterflies, or the brush-footed butterflies, as they're also known, about 40 to 50 million years on Earth, which is a pretty long time. The monarch butterfly, if I had to take an educated guess, we're probably talking about sometime between now and 40 million years ago. I don't think it was one of the first butterflies. It's quite advanced, but it certainly is one of the most charismatic butterflies. So we're probably talking about in the millions of years old as far as a species. The migratory phenomenon, though, really what we think again, our best educated hypothesis as scientists out there is it probably came about at the end of the last ice age, hence the ice age photo here. So sometime at the end of the last ice age. Why is that? Why did this migratory phenomenon, this tropical butterfly that was probably flying around, Costa Rica and the Amazon and Brazil for millions and millions of years, minding its own business, just being like any other beautiful butterfly out there, why at the end of the last ice age, probably about 20,000 years ago, at the end of the Pleistocene, as we call it, why all of a sudden did it become migratory and make this huge, huge travel each and every year? Well, this is where it gets pretty interesting. So essentially, the last ice age had ice sheets all the way down through mostly the middle of North America. So almost all of Canada was covered in ice. A lot of North America was as well in terms of the US borders, far south of the US border. As those ice sheets retreated 30, 20,000, 10,000 years ago, it gave rise, as these glaciers receded, it scoured the earth, it dug up the soil, and it gave rise to this proliferation of this plant group. I'm sure you guys are already guessing what this is. This is a milkweed plant. So what happened is as the glaciers receded, all these milkweeds started to begin to emerge in the North American continent. There was speciation. New milkweed species probably evolved during this time between present day and 10 to 20,000 years ago. So the big thing is you have this tropical butterfly that's hanging around Mexico, flying around, the areas of Mexico City and the Yucatan Peninsula and in Belize and Costa Rica and Panama and all these areas. And all of a sudden, this proliferation of its host plant. So everybody probably has maybe a general idea. Host plant is what the caterpillars eat. It's a very integral part of a butterfly's life cycle. It is not the nectar source. Even though these flowers do have some nectar, the host plant is the key part of a caterpillar's life, and it's what, the leaves are what the caterpillars eat. So this hyperabundance of its host plant begin to proliferate and spread out across North America. And if you see the proliferation of milkweed, this chart shows the range of not just milkweed, but the present day range of the North American monarch butterfly too. So what happened essentially, in short, is this tropical butterfly, again, flying around Mexico, a couple individuals, maybe dozens, took a leap of faith and they said, well, it's starting to warm a little bit. Things are getting better. Let me fly north and see what's going on up there. Well, so here's the long and the short of it is that the neotropics, the North American tropics or Central American tropics, are home to about 8 different milkweed species. Okay, North America by present day is home to about 108 different species of milkweed. That's a huge, huge difference. So what it is basically is there was this massive spread of an untapped food resource. So monarchs presumably being a smart butterfly, said, hey, let's go find this amazing resource. Let's go tap into this. Nothing else is really eating it. Nothing else is taking advantage of it. And there's a ton of food up there. Again, they're all having this conversation in, the butterfly language, whatever that is. So they're flying all the way to North America, and they're finding this hyperabundance of food. It's like the most massive smorgasbord buffet that we could ever dream of, and they proliferate. They do really well. The monarch, or the milkweed, does well. The monarch does really well. So what happens is they make it to North America, they spread out. This is, presumably in the spring or summertime of one year. But what monarchs can't deal well with, being a tropical butterfly and basically just an insect in general, they can't deal real well with this white fluffy stuff, this snow. They can't deal well with freezing rain. They can't do well with ice and ice crystals. They actually can withstand pretty cold temperatures, which is pretty phenomenal. They actually have a type of antifreeze in their blood, their hemolymph, that does prevent their blood from freezing. So adult monarchs can deal with temperatures all the way down to 0 Fahrenheit. But what they can't deal well with is the moisture and the wetness that often comes with it, the snow, the freezing rain. So what they said is that, okay, great, we found this great food resource, but A, the food resource is not there in the winter, of course, and B, they can't deal with the wintry conditions. So probably within a year or two, all those butterflies that decided to go all the way north to the United States and southern Canada to find this massive milkweed population, all this food resource, said, well, we better go back down to the tropics. And they go back down to Mexico, and they find these amazing fir trees, the Oyamel fir trees, in this very, very small, isolated section of central Mexico. And they decide to overwinter here until the North American winter fades and milkweed plants once again start to grow and start to become a food resource for their caterpillars. So let that soak in. That is phenomenal. I mean, that is the craziest thing, that, a small subset of this tropical butterfly population decided to take a risk, go to North America, start eating milkweed, but then by the time the snow started falling and their lives essentially became in danger, they went back down to the tropics, found a small isolated grove in Mexico, and figured out this entire migratory phenomenon on their own. And then again, through probably 20,000 years, the first one we expect to have probably done this about 10 to 20,000 years ago, it's been honed to the point that now every year, anywhere from 200 million to 2 billion with a B monarch butterflies make this migration every year. It's pretty phenomenal. So yeah, and this is what it looks like down there. These groves, these amazing, amazing trees covered in monarch butterflies, just thick, almost carpeted. It's pretty sensational. So what likely happened is this population of butterflies that was, again, in Central America, in a normal butterfly population, like the same number of individuals that a blue morpho would have down there, they expanded their population to essentially grow to unprecedented levels. They did really, really well. They're the geniuses of the butterfly world to figure this out. So it's absolutely amazing. So in short, to answer that question, why do they migrate? Well, they migrate to get food and then to retreat out of bad weather conditions. And they just somehow figured out to do this over multiple generations each year. And we'll get to that here in a bit. So the next big question, where are they going? Well, I mentioned they're going down to central Mexico, but it's a very, very specific spot. It's in and around the state of Michoacan, very, very near and proximal to a town called Angungueo. And here's a map that you can kind of see here. You see the zoomed out area just kind of right in the center of Mexico, just west of Mexico City, about 100 miles more or less, in these very, very concentrated groves of a very specific type of tree, the Oyamel fir, Abies religiosa. This is the tree that they've adapted to, and it has a lot to do with the microclimate. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but they've essentially found the perfect area to conserve their food resources. So if you think, if a butterfly had to fly down somewhere, they're flying 3,000 miles, they're using a lot of food to get down there, right? They're using a lot of calories to fly, hundreds of miles per day over the course of a month or two. And then they need to return. That same butterfly needs to return the next spring. We'll go over the annual cycle and the calendar here just in a little bit. But so as a result, what they really need to do is they need to find an area, a climate, and a temperature that allows them to quite literally chill out, to hang tight. Don't burn up a bunch of your food resources, stay down there and just hunker down and wait out the winter. And what they did is they found this small area that has an average temperature between day and night, between highs and lows, an average temperature of around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And it turns out that is the perfect temperature level to kind of send them into this quasi hibernation so that they don't burn up fat reserves, they don't burn up calories and energy, and they can actually increase their lifespan and return to North America in about 4.5 months' time. It's pretty fantastic. This phenomenon was discovered, well, it was probably discovered by indigenous people well before this, but the true scientific discovery, if you may remember this or have seen it in the news recently, the discovery was in 1975 and then published in August 1976, National Geographic. This is Kathy Brugger. Her and her husband, Ken Brugger, were part of this kind of citizen science mission. This is well before the term citizen science even was coined, but basically a professor from the University of Toronto, Dr. Fred Urquhart, had this mission. He started tagging butterflies, and he knew that, when all the butterflies disappear every winter, yet they return every spring, they have to be going somewhere. So he started tagging them. He started putting a call out to all these people in North America and Mexico and Canada and Central America and saying, hey, if you see these butterflies, please do let me know. And he hit the gold mine when he met this couple who happened to be on a motorcycle trip across Mexico, with nothing but a couple of photos of the monarch butterfly, now going village to village to village, city to city to city, just asking local folks if they had seen any of these monarch butterflies. Well, in due time, they did find them. They found the little town of Angungeo, and the locals quickly showed them that these little orange and black butterflies were gathered by the absolute millions in these high altitude forests. And it made a huge, huge discovery. It was published again in 1976, and it kind of shook the scientific world because a lot of people weren't even knowing to ask these questions. But now that they found that this incredible migratory phenomenon was happening with an insect with barely even a brain, if we can call it a brain, a central ganglion, we call it. Okay, I got a little technical there. I'll pull back. But, it's amazing. So we've learned so much since then, and it's truly incredible what the science is behind the mechanisms for orientation, for navigation, how they're able to find their way, how they're able to tell when it's ready to go down there. And like I said, they do so over about 4 different generations over the course of the year. Pretty amazing. So again, we'll get into more of that here in a second, but yeah, so the little town of Angungeo, it's a former silver mining town. That'll be important here in just a bit. It's turned into a beautiful little city these days. It's known as a Pueblo Mágico, which is kind of like a historic designation. It's painted with monarch murals, and it's got old churches, and it's everything you want from a little quaint colonial Mexican town. It's a really, really cool place, and I've had the privilege to stay there for many, many years, basing my monarch expeditions out of that town. So yeah, basically they're going to this small little area, small concentrated area, just on the border of the state of Mexico and the state of Michoacan. And they overwinter in anywhere from 12 to 19 different little colonies. So you may have seen photos in years past and thought, oh, well, it's just one big colony. It's actually spread out quite a bit regionally, but they're mostly concentrated in that central belt. You can see here in the photo, that central yellow area. And there's about 4 colonies that are actually open to the public. So a lot of these are on high on the tips of volcanoes that would just be, multiple days treks to get to 17,000 feet. So they're not all accessible, and some of them are not accessible because the scientific community, the local authorities, do want to protect them, and we don't necessarily want tourists at every single one of these colonies, just in case there's any sort of side effects. Fortunately, that was a big topic of my dissertation. Fortunately, we have not noticed a lot of those over the years, but nevertheless, up to 19 different small populations over the course of the winter. And they overwinter in these beautiful fir forests, like I mentioned. So it's not just the temperature that they're seeking. Remember, they're seeking about 40 degrees Fahrenheit average between night and day. So the days can get up into the 50s and 60s, and even at the end of the season, low 70s. At night, it can often be at freezing or even a little bit below. But also a key part of it is the humidity level. So there's a very specific microclimate that these butterflies are looking for. And as you can see here, it's a beautiful, mostly well intact forest. And the forest actually acts like a blanket. So when we get into the conservation section here in a bit, you'll hear a little bit more about this. But what happens, since it's a very closed canopy, it actually holds quite a bit of moisture underneath the tops of these trees. Insects having exoskeletons and all sorts of other scientific stuff I won't go into, they need a certain amount of moisture in the air, otherwise they don't do too well. So it's a really, really specific area, and there aren't many places in the world, let alone, or in Mexico, let alone the world, that has this very specific microclimate. So the forests are of utmost importance. The problem with some of the conservation issues, when people are deforesting the area, maybe just taking out 1 or 2 trees, is that it's like opening holes in the blanket or opening holes in the umbrella that lets heat escape, it lets moisture escape, it lets bigger storms roll in and cause more damage. So the intact nature of the forest is absolutely paramount. And fortunately, I'll share with you that deforestation rates are at an all-time low here in the past few years, actually past since 2012. So there are some definite positives. You can see what the monarchs do here. They hang from the branches in these massive clusters, sometimes even several layers of monarchs deep. So you can see they're looking for such specific cues from the environment. It's not like any tree or any area or any slope or any mountain will do. They need very, very specific areas, and they return here each and every year. As an added interesting thing, the OML fur, the actual circumference of the needles happens to be the exact circumference of the tarsal claws of the monarch butterfly. Tarsal claws is basically like their hands. If you measure the diameter, the circumference of their hands, how much surface area they're able to grab onto, it's almost the exact circumference of these fur needles, which is truly amazing. So whether they were seeking that or whether it was just this co-evolutionary response that the monarch said, hey, well, this is the area we want to be, and lo and behold, these trees are really, really easy to hang on to. They do so well in these OML firs because if a big wind goes through, if it does rain, or if the rare snowfall does occur in this area, they can hold on really, really tight. It's a truly miraculous thing to see a big rush of wind go through the colonies, and these big, big boughs laden with tens of thousands of monarchs per branch just sways in the wind. It's pretty spectacular to see, but they're really good at holding on. And you can see they blanket the trees. They can even hang on a couple layers deep, holding on to one another. It's pretty phenomenal. But of course, they're not sedentary the whole time. And this is one of the initial great mysteries of what's going on with the monarch migration. This is not, I mean, look at this photo. This is down in the sanctuaries. This is not your typical hibernation. This is not like a brown or a black bear digging into a burrow and sleeping for 3 months. This is quite the opposite. They're super active. Well, it turns out that monarch butterflies, again, keeping in mind that these butterflies have to preserve their food resources. There's almost no food down in these colonies. They're essentially fasting. So they have to preserve what energy they were able to store on the way down to Mexico each year. So it turns out that when temperatures warm, like they do so every day, and certainly as they do later into the season, as temperatures warm, the monarch butterflies are so efficient at flying and gliding that it actually acts like a convection air conditioning system to cool their body temperatures down. So they're able to preserve those lipids, those fats, the energy molecules that will give them the amount of energy to make the flight back north to complete their migration. So that's a really, really interesting thing there. They're so efficient at flying. Again, these things fly 3,000 miles like it's nothing. They're so efficient at flying that it's easier and more cost effective from a body standpoint to glide and soar around to cool down and then take light on another tree, maybe in the shadows, in the shade, to cool off a little bit so they don't burn up too much energy. Crazy stuff. So I'm telling you, the whole story of the monarch is just replete with example after example after example of almost otherworldly kind of phenomena that they're able to employ for their very survival. And we as scientists, we love it because although they're probably one of the most well-studied butterflies on the planet, where every answer that we find asks 2 more questions, and it's a never-ending beautiful story that we're able to research. But fortunately in this presentation, hopefully you're learning a lot of those answers to some of those core initial questions. So another big one, how in the world do they find their way? So this is pretty wild. So you have this tiny little butterfly weighing less than a gram. It can fly 3,000 miles in one direction. This is one butterfly that leaves the US and southern Canada each fall, flies all the way down to Mexico, overwinters for 4.5 months, and makes about 1/3 of the return trip, more or less, to like northern Mexico, kind of like Texas area, and lays their eggs, and that completes the migration. Then they die, and then the next generation kind of leapfrog from there. We'll get to more specifics on that in a second, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of the time span, the distance that individual butterflies fly. It's pretty amazing. So 3,000 miles, from New York or New England all the way down to Mexico, overwintering, and another 1,000 miles north. I mean, we're talking about a pretty amazing feat here. And the reason I show this photo specifically is this is taken down in the monarch butterfly sanctuaries. This is a butterfly after it has made that 3,000-mile journey. Look at how perfect it looks. Look at how fresh it looks. I mean, these butterflies are made to do this. They look no worse for wear. It's amazing. It really is. So anyway, how do they find their way? So the first thing that they employ is an internal time compensated sun compass. This is probably the most complicated one, but I'll break it down into a couple of its parts. So the first thing is that they have a sun compass, so they know that the sun rises in a certain part of the sky and sets in a certain part of the sky. We know that too, but they have it internally. It's actually based in their eyes and their antennae. They also have a time compensation mechanism via circadian clock. So just like we have a circadian clock, we kind of know when it's more or less ready to wake up. When we're ready to wake up in the morning, we know kind of when it's midday. We kind of know when it's getting to be nightfall and it's time to go to bed. We kind of have this clock. So they merge these two things. They know where the sun's going to be, and they know what time of day it is. So they merge this to know at this time of the day, the sun should be here. So this direction is south, this direction is west, this direction is north and east. So combining those two abilities all through very, very basic sensory organs in their antennae and their eyes, they can actually figure out which direction is south and mostly southwest. Okay, we'll get to kind of that directional thing in here in a second. The second mechanism, once they have a general bearing for southwest, is they use a magnetic sense. And believe it or not, they actually, they have this metaphorical compass in their eyes and in their antennae, but they also have literal magnetic compasses in the base of their wings. So that arrow is pointing right to the base of their wings. It's a metal called magnetite that they are believed to sequester or actually draw out from the milkweed. So when the caterpillars are munching and munching and munching over the course of weeks, they actually sequester this magnetite into their bodies. And then as the caterpillar turns, you can't make this stuff up. As the caterpillar turns into an adult, it reorganizes all of its cells, and this magnetite turns into a little magnetic bar compass at the base of their wing. So they actually know truly where magnetic anomalies are. They might actually know where north, south, east, and west are, just like we would if we're out in the woods looking at an actual compass. It's pretty fantastic. And one additional thing I'll tell you on this. So this is probably one of the more controversial things that has been researched and proven and disproven and then reproven and disproven. And I'll try to not go too far down the rabbit hole here, but I think this is one of the most impressive and interesting recent findings from monarch biologists. So this was initially proven back in the 80s that they do have this magnetic sense. And remember when I was mentioning that Angungeo used to be an old silver mining town? Well, coincidence or not, I think no coincidence, the mountain range that these butterflies migrate to just happen to be at the apex of two major mountain ranges in Mexico, the Sierra Madres Oriental and Occidental. There is a heavy metal deposit in those mountains. There is a magnetic anomaly at the apex of those mountains right around Angungeo. These butterflies, no doubt, as they get a general bearing southwest from their time compensated sun compass, as they get closer, and need a little bit more specific cue, they lock on to this magnetic cue. And this was proven in the 80s. Now, like all good science and scientists, people are constantly proving and disproving and reproving each other. But here's the crazy thing. So when this experiment, and I won't go into the details of how it was experimented, but it was in a lab and it was, bar magnets and it was measuring flight direction, et cetera, et cetera. When this was disproven, it was because they couldn't replicate the settings consistently. So, that's essentially the scientific method is someone comes along and replicates your exact experiment. If they can't do it, your experiment is not really credible. Well, what the most recent one has found is that, okay, they don't always use the magnetic sense, but you can trigger the magnetic sense with 100% accuracy if you subject the monarch at the same time to a blue spectrum of light. So blue spectrum of light. The crazy part about this is one of the big unanswered questions for a long time is how, if monarchs need the sun to orient on a big scale, what do they do on cloudy days? What do they do in thunderstorms? Well, it just happens to be that the same wavelength of light that they need to trigger this magnetic sense is the same wavelength of light that is filtered through clouds. Meaning they switch gears, they switch from time compensated sun compass to magnetic sense when it's cloudy to orient, and they have a backup navigation system. This is crazy stuff. And so this is legit. This is the most recent study. It's pretty much unanimously agreed upon that yes, they do have magnetic sense. It's amazing the story that got us here over decades of proving and disproving, but it's also answered in the process a big, perhaps bigger question of what do they do on cloudy days? Because if they're taking a month or two to migrate down to Mexico, there's some cloudy days. They're migrating, frankly, partly during the monsoon, or sorry, not monsoon, but the hurricane season, the typhoon season. So there are cloudy days. This answers that. And the third and final way, as you're getting closer and closer and closer, is they use chemical cues and smell. And this is essentially the last layer of the ingredients here to get them to almost the exact same trees that their ancestors were the previous year. So the reason I show this picture is this is a macro or a zoomed in stereo microscope shot of a butterfly wing, of the monarch wing. And you can see here, it actually looks like little roof tiles. And so the butterflies, as are moths, are a member of the Lepidoptera, which means scaly wings. And these are like scales. These are like fish scales. In fact, they're even more ephemeral than fish scales. If you were to touch butterflies, you might get a little bit of a dust on your hand because they have millions and millions of these scales. Their main function is for pigmentation and for waterproofing, but they also have a chemical signal to them. They smell just a little bit. So what I'm getting at here is when you have millions, if not billions of butterflies fluttering around, flying around, running into one another, they're kind of scraping off those scales, those roof tiles, those shingles. Those shingles are falling off and flying off, and they're floating down to the ground. And there's almost like this dust, this glitter that you can see if you had a microscope or even just a magnifying glass on the plants, in the soil. And there's no doubt a chemical cue that gets picked up by monarch butterflies. So if you think kind of like a Russian nesting doll, the big one on the outside is that time compensated sun compass. When that doesn't work, they do use magnetism, but certainly as they get closer to the mountain range, after they've been following a southwest trajectory for weeks and in the better part of a month, they start to get this magnetic cue to the mountain range. And then finally, once they get into the range of the forest, they switch on their chemical cue and their sensory perception from their antennae. Once again, these antennae are amazing to get them down to almost the very same trees that, believe it or not, their great grandparents were the year before. Let that soak in. It's the great grandparents from the year before, which is absolutely amazing, because what that tells us is that there's no learning, there's no imprinting, there's no, mama butterfly teaching the baby butterfly, hey, don't forget to turn on your magnetic ability at this point. No, it's all a genetic program. It's all just innate to their very being. Pretty amazing stuff. So at long last, what does the rest of the year look like? I wanted to kind of give the whole picture of what's the geographic area. What does the year look like for monarch butterfly? So in general, this is what we're looking at. So monarch butterflies, again, they occupy most of North America, or most of the U.S., the southern range of Canada, essentially all the way to the southern extent of milkweed, or the northern extent of milkweed, southern Canada. So they're just north of the border there. They migrate in the fall. They stay down there in the winter. They return in the spring. And again, where the last little bit of that green arrow near Texas, that's about where they lay their eggs, and then they die. And then there's about a month of no monarchs to be seen because they're all in egg and caterpillar form. Once those caterpillars turn into adults, they turn into these flying insects. They're able to further disperse and repopulate the rest of North America. Now, here's another wild thing, is that the migratory butterflies have a different lifespan than the non-migratory butterflies. So like I said, it's the great grandparents that were there the year before, or the great grandchildren that return the year after. So there's several summer generations that take the summer, take May, June, July, August to repopulate North America. So that means that there are about 4 generations before that next migratory phenomenon down south. The lifespan, again, like I was getting at, for a non-migratory monarch is about 2 months. from egg to adult, but somehow migratory monarchs are able to shift their genes, change their genetic coding a little bit, and actually live 4 times as long. They're able to live about 8 months total. Once again, pretty miraculous. And oftentimes, as a tangential aside, oftentimes people question, why should we study monarch butterflies? Why put government funding? Why put NIH funding or these grants, Nat Geo grants to study insects or butterflies or monarch butterflies of all things? Well, I'll tell you, the more we understand this ability to increase a lifespan by 4 times, I mean, that's important stuff for science in general. I mean, what if we're able to do that for agricultural crops? What if we're able to do that for ourselves? I mean, again, going down a deep, dark rabbit hole there, but nevertheless, it's an interesting thing that we should really learn a lot more about. We do know a bit though. So essentially what they're able to do, this migratory generation, again, at the end of the summer, at the fall, start of the fall, they get these cues from the environment, and we'll talk about that in a second. And they start to switch their genome over to a migratory monarch butterfly. And the main thing that they're doing is they're turning off all their reproductive cells, their reproductive organisms. They do not reproduce while in migratory phase. And they divert all that energy, all that metabolic energy that you would normally use to produce gametes, eggs and sperm. All that goes redirected over to what we call somatic maintenance. And somatic maintenance is basically a fancy way of saying the repair and regeneration of cells. That is the fountain of youth, essentially. So the reason we get old and die is because we can't repair and regenerate our cells at the same frequency. We can't do it enough. So what they're able to do is they're able to shift their internal bodies and actually redirect, shift the tracks on a railroad, so to speak. And instead of producing these things that they don't need to reproduce, they're actually able to repair and regenerate their cells to allow them to live 4 times as long. Absolutely amazing. So here is a cool graphic. This is a newer one from Journey North, and we'll go into some of my favorite resources going forward on monarch biology and monarch butterfly conservation here in a bit. But this is a really cool one. You can kind of see there's a few different generations, like I said, that sort of leapfrog and repopulate North America in the summer. About April, June, July, and August. And then come August, those butterflies that are hatching out of the eggs, those are the ones that will make that migration. And that'll be that one butterfly. They don't, no more reproducing, no more eggs and butterflies. It's that one butterfly that lives from August to about April the next year. Pretty cool stuff. And here we have a female monarch laying eggs, just to show you a bit of an example of what that looks like. Also, good takeaway point if you are interested in doing any of your own butterfly exploration in your own backyard garden, like we'll talk about here in a second. This is kind of what to look for. Nevertheless, let's go into conservation. So I'll certainly take questions at the end here. I know I covered a lot in terms of their natural history and their migration phenomenon and whatnot, but I want to kind of shift gears here a little bit to talk about their conservation, because this is a huge part of the story. So it's without a doubt that monarchs are at conservation risk. We don't want to get into this situation where we see the one lone monarch on a dying fir tree here. This is not the thing we want to see. We also have to acknowledge that monarchs, because of their own independence, because of their own genius, more or less, I use that word proliferate. They have expanded their population so much, so abnormally, because of their harnessing of this migration, that they've expanded beyond any other butterfly's number because of that. But nevertheless, even though we might never say that monarchs themselves are quote unquote endangered, the migratory phenomenon is indeed endangered. And I think as a scientist, as a naturalist, it's one of the most beautiful things and one of the most amazing things on our planet. So let's talk about the numbers here in a little bit. These are the total hectarage. Hectare is about 2.5 acres, more or less, that historically the monarch butterfly is covered over the course of the winter. So scientists will go down there and they'll measure the entire area that monarchs cover, and then we use a number of about 5,000 butterflies per square meter. And so that actually correlates, and we get understandings of how many butterflies were down there from year to year. Well, this graph shows us, unfortunately, that they have been declining, but it's not always a steady decline. There's some years that go up, some years that go down. And so every year, every season, it's always the big question mark. And I always get pretty nervous because you can see these huge swings. Look between 2003 and 2004, the difference from 11.12 to 2.19. I mean, that's a huge, huge drop. Now, that was a single bad storm year, and I could, do a whole another hour lecture on what happened that year anomalously. But nevertheless, what you see is a few small pinpointed events can change their populations greatly. So they have to be at higher numbers to withstand such a drop. If you look at that 13-14 year of 0.67, if that year got a bad drop, even further, what happens the next year? What if they're completely wiped out? And that's something we don't ever want to see. So a lot of my life work has been dedicated to making sure we can keep these numbers as high as possible. So anyway, I'll just tell you a quick story here. So this was last year, around January of 2019. This story came out. So I haven't talked about this a whole lot, but there actually are two migratory populations of monarch butterflies. There's the eastern and there's the western population. We don't talk about the western population all that much because they don't really behave in the exact same way. That it's a much, much, much smaller migration. We're talking about thousands to tens of thousands versus hundreds of millions. Nevertheless, they are a great bellwether for understanding how monarchs behave in general. So essentially everything east of the Rocky Mountains is the butterflies we've been talking about so far. Every monarch west of the Rocky Mountains is this California population that migrates to and overwinters on eucalyptus trees of all things near Monterey and Santa Cruz and the like. So what we look for is a little bit of an early sign of, okay, what's happening in California's population early in the winter, because that might tell us what's going on with the Mexico population. I saw this article from the New York Times just as I was about to go down and lead a trip last January and get this massive sinking feeling in my stomach, like, oh my gosh, an 86% drop. We can't sustain that as a whole for all monarchs in North America. But I'll tell you, it was the most amazing thing, and this just kind of shows and illustrates that picture of that up and down movement of that graph I just showed. As I get down to Mexico just a week later, and I see, I would say anecdotally, the biggest monarch population I had ever seen out of, at that time, 17 years of guiding down there. And then I kid you not, the very next day, this is published and sent to me by my colleagues over at World Wildlife Fund, that the monarch butterfly populations, the Mexico butterflies, that eastern, that much larger population, is significantly on the rise. And check out this graph. So we see here, you look on the far right, that 2.48 was the year prior. 6.05 hectares was the year that we were seeing. That the same year that the California population took that big dip, we see the Mexico population expanding significantly. And if you go left, that red line, I mean, look at the last time it was at that number. I mean, we're talking about the better part of a decade, more of 12 years. So we had huge positive thought about that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we need. We can't have these downward trends. Now, unfortunately, numbers have come out in the last couple of days that we're looking at this current season of 1920, looking at back down at about 2.83 hectares, which, I would love for it to be sustained at 6.05. I would love for it to climb back down to back up to historic levels of 11.12 and others. But nevertheless, we got to find some positivity, and it's not down to the ones in the sub 1 hectares that it was just several years ago. Nevertheless, it's something we want to keep our eyes on. Although the western population in California continues to decline, and we have major concerns about that, there is evidence that the monarch butterflies in North America can do what we call pan mixing. They can actually move a little bit from California to the eastern population via Arizona, possibly. So again, as we see the numbers decline in California, it's ever more important to understand what's going on conservation-wise for the Mexican monarchs. So I want to talk about some of the threats now, just so you're aware. I think, one of the best things you can do for conservation is be aware and understand what the threats are and talk to people about them and vote your way, vote your feelings. So understanding illegal logging is one of the biggest things. Fortunately, this is also a bit of a success story. So illegal logging, as you can see here, all this orange that looks like dust on the trees, those are all monarch butterflies. And you can see how closely the farmland is encroaching on that monarch butterfly habitat. It's not a good thing. And we saw a lot of this in the 90s and the early 2000s. There were a lot of illegal farming operations, actually pretty big mafia-esque type organizations that would come in and clear entire plots of land overnight. It was really scary, and at one time we thought that was absolutely the biggest risk to monarch survival. It's still something that we keep in the back of our mind, and frankly front of our mind in a lot of ways. But I'm happy to say that illegal logging has pretty much all been cut out since 2012. Past Mexican presidents have done an amazing job in getting rid of those big organizations, those big mills, from deforesting the monarch butterfly biosphere, as we call it, reserve, specifically. So a good thing there. What we're still seeing, though, is what we call ant logging. And you can look at this forest, and it does look a little bit bare. I mean, these trees are smaller, they're more spindly, they're not the diameter the monarch butterflies need. So the biggest problem we have now is not necessarily the massive wide-scale logging. That would be worse if it was still going on. But the problem we have now is what we call ant logging, where one guy in his burrow will go into the forest overnight with a chainsaw and cut out one big old growth tree. And recall what I said earlier is the forest acting like an umbrella or acting like a blanket, even though it's just one tree out of a sea of thousands. If you cut the taller, the bigger, the more permanent, the older trees, you're creating a huge hole in that canopy, and it can actually do a lot more disproportionate harm because it's opening it up to winds, it's opening up to rain or storms. So we got to be very vigilant of this. Both these things are going on the Mexico side, but this is a tri-nation phenomenon. In the US, our biggest issues are agricultural practices. Essentially what we're doing in the Midwest. They're not all bad, but there are some that are very specific. I want to show this map. So, again, looking at that eastern population of monarch butterflies, the Corn Belt of the US is really one of their mainstays. That's where most of the summer monarchs ultimately end up. I would say at least half of them do end up there. And you have sort of questionable agricultural practices, specifically with a technology or a crop known as Roundup Ready crops. And so what this is, if you're not familiar, actually back in the day, we talked about like BT crops as being the biggest issue. Those are almost non-existent anymore. Roundup Ready crops are the biggest challenge because there are three main ones that are being in use: corn, soybeans, and sorghum. And what it does is a company will actually impregnate the genome of corn, soybean, and sorghum, like wheat, with Roundup resistance. And Roundup is the same Roundup you're probably thinking that you might see at Lowe's or Home Depot and you spray your driveway with. What that enables the farmer to do is plant this crop in huge acreage and then go through and spray the entire crop with Roundup, killing absolutely every other weed other than the agricultural product they're trying to produce. So that means that it's killing, well, you're probably thinking it, the milkweed. So if the milkweed is dead, the monarch's plant from one season to next, the monarch's food source completely disappears. This is a bad problem. Now, fortunately, there are some solutions to all this sort of stuff, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So the first reasons for optimism is the reforestation efforts are absolutely unparalleled. They're amazing. World Wildlife Fund is actually at the core of it, and to date, they have worked with locals to plant over 13 million OML fir trees back in the monarch habitat of Mexico. This is pretty phenomenal. What they're able to do is they're actually able to employ local folks from the local communities. When it's not monarch season, these folks don't have a lot of employment options. They can tend their own fields, but they don't have the same employment that once existed with the surge of ecotourism from December through March. So what they're able to do, this is a win-win. They're able to employ these folks, give money to the local economy, add value to the natural area by showing that, hey, listen, preserving monarchs is good for all of us, and actually reforest the habitat. And it's pretty phenomenal the scale they're able to do this. This is actually just the entrance of El Rosario Reserve. You can see all the many hundreds and thousands of OML seedlings ready to be replanted in the coming spring. It's very inspirational. I'm absolutely amazed and impressed with the level of ecotourism down in these monarch sanctuaries. A study about 15 years ago estimated that 250,000 people do visit the monarch butterfly biosphere reserves each year. So I've been running trips down there, for many years with Natural Habitat, and it's amazing to see the increase in tourism. Now I have to say that we do things a little bit different, so we're able to avoid those main crowds. But what's equally inspiring is that the vast majority, about 95 to 98% of those tourists, 95% of that 250,000 is actually local tourism. It's people on large bus tours from Mexico City and Guadalajara and Morelia. So what that shows me is that local folks are engaged and interested in their own backyard, which I think is probably one of the more powerful things for that long-term staying power of the monarch butterfly and these reserves and the forest. So very, very good thing. I think ecotourism is one of the most powerful things to exist to defend monarchs. Some really cool novel things coming out in the world of conservation in North America too. So I talked about this whole Roundup Ready crop thing and the issue of milkweeds disappearing. What is happening from the Environmental Defense Fund? I think this is only the second year that this has been happening. So I'm not sure if I don't have any updates on where it's at, but the concept is ingenious. Essentially what they're doing is they're creating a fund through donations, through advocacy, through grants, that they will pay farmers in the Midwest, in that corn belt, to not spray their entire fields, to not get rid of monarch host plants, not get rid of milkweed. So they're incentivizing through dollars, through finances, the preservation of that food source. You know, the farmer, if that weed is infringing on his or her business, you know, that's one thing. But if they can keep it there and actually make more money, that's a whole better thing. So we're actually seeing this working quite well. There's also other incentives and other initiatives to get more roadside planting for milkweed plants, et cetera, in North America, so US and Southern Canada. Pretty cool. And frankly, you know, I think a huge part of it is just the fanaticism of monarch butterflies. I think this is one of the biggest reasons for optimism is if you go on Google and type monarch butterfly and then hit images or videos, the number of people absolutely mesmerized and in love with these butterflies is massive. It's huge. There are movies and videos and all sorts of stuff coming out all the time. So I think that it's truly inspiring to see how many people have fallen in love with this butterfly over the years, whether it's because they've been in their own backyard, seeing them flying around in the spring and the summer, whether they've been down there to see the monarchs migrating in the fall and winter. I'm not sure, but there's a huge level of fanaticism all the way to really impressive, staggering levels you can see here from this great paint job here. You got crazy people writing books on the monarch migration, shameless plug. And, you know, again, I think the idea is that you get so many people rallying behind something, there are going to be positive changes. And I got to say, having been in this world, in this monarch butterfly ecosystem, so to speak, almost 2 decades, I've seen such a huge notable improvement in people's perception, people's passion in monarch butterflies and how that's translating into actual conservation. Like I quite literally had tears in my eyes when I read that World Wildlife Fund news bulletin last winter when I was worried about the monarchs because of the California population. I went down there and I saw the biggest, most impressive colony in my years. And I thought, goodness gracious, I mean, what if this is all working? Like what if these big spikes up continue steadily throughout the years and we get a huge rescue to the monarch butterfly population? So as I conclude here, just a couple more slides. I always get this question. I want to impart some wisdom here of what you can do if you already love monarch butterflies, if you now love monarch butterflies, what can you be doing to help save them? Well, I think one of the most important things is plant milkweed, in your backyard. We're getting into the growing season here pretty soon. Planting local milkweed is absolutely key. I won't go into a lot of specifics as to why local milkweed is so important, but it really is. If you go to the garden store, like big garden stores like Home Depot and Lowe's, they usually sell one type of milkweed plant, and it's known as Asclepias curassavica, or tropical milkweed. Now the thing is that monarchs love that, but there are a bit too many toxins in that plant for all monarchs to use. Remember I said there's over 100 different species of milkweed in North America. Depending on where in the country you live, there are about 6 major milkweed species that you can pick up on and plant in your backyard to keep your local monarchs happy and healthy. And actually parallel to that, if you want to learn which milkweed species are found in your area, go to that very first link I have there, just Google it or go on the web and go monarchwatch.org, and they've got some great resources for figuring out the exact species. They'll even sell you not monarch, but they'll even sell you milkweed seeds. Get involved with World Wildlife Fund Monarch programs. So World Wildlife Fund US and Mexico are really, really leading the charge on information. They're leading charge in the research, the butterfly counts, the conservation. Just simply Google it and sign up for one of their newsletters, get informed and stay informed. Promote conservation of habitats, roadside conservation, prairie conservation. minimize insecticide use, create and register your way station. So if you're really into planting milkweeds and you're really into monarch conservation, you can actually go on to Monarch Watch, you can go on to Monarch Joint Venture, and you can certify your backyard as a monarch way station, being one of the stopover points that the monarchs actually go through on their way down to Mexico. It's pretty cool stuff. And at the end of the day, the more you learn and the more information you share on accurate news on monarch butterfly conservation, stories, the biology, the more you know, the more you share, the more the story gets out there, the more people fall in love, and the more we can save these monarch butterflies. There's a great quote that says, you cannot save what you do not love, and you cannot love what you do not know. So let's get to know the monarch butterfly a little bit more, and let's do it together. And with that, I conclude the presentation. Thanks, folks. I think we've got time for some Q&A.
We do, Court. Thank you so much. So everybody listening, please stay with us if you can for our Q&A. We'll probably go a little bit past the top of the hour. If you can't stick with us, we'll send a link to the replay so you can catch up. But we have some great questions here, and I don't want to miss out on some of these, especially because our audience, not only are they all around the world, they're all age ranges today. And we have a listener from California who is a third grader with us today. We rarely get young people on our webinars, so I want to get his questions in. The first, he's got two questions. The first is, do monarch butterflies stop at night and sleep?
Great question. Yes, they generally do. Now, one of the difficult things about studying monarch butterflies is that unless you can follow an individual monarch or a group of monarchs from start to finish, it's really hard to know definitively what every single monarch butterfly does. But we've received reports, and if you are on the migratory path, there are certain points in that eastern population, state parks and national refuges, that you can go, and at certain times in that fall, you can see them, and they do land in the hundreds and hundreds on trees and on bushes, and they sleep overnight. There are also some really interesting reports, believe it or not, of oil rigs in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico that receive hundreds, if not thousands, of monarch butterflies a couple times as they're migrating because they just need a place to rest. They're flying over the water, and that Gulf of Mexico is pretty big. So they're flying over, and they actually land on these man-made oil rig platforms to sleep at night. Now, what the butterflies did before the oil rigs, who knows? But nevertheless, yes, there's plenty of evidence that monarch butterflies do land each and every night. However, that all being said, they absolutely have the capability to fly longer. Maybe what we're going to learn next is that they have some sort of amazing weather sensing cue. And if they know a storm's coming, they might spend the night in flight. Maybe they need to make it really, really fast. They need to get out of harm's way. I would not be surprised if they learn that in coming studies and in coming years. Great question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the follow-up question from our third grader listening, how do we differentiate between a male and female, and do they stay together as a gender? Do we have that information?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, it's actually pretty easy to identify a male and a female. So males have these small little scent pouches on the upper side of the hind wing. So if you're looking at my picture here, you see that one butterfly in flight just over the word listening. Just near the tip of their abdomen, if this was a male, there would be two kind of swollen pouches, almost like the size of a sesame seed, on one of those black veins. If it does not have those pouches, if you do not see that little black dot in the middle of the vein, it is a female. Females also generally have slightly thicker black veins to them. That's not always the best way to tell, but that little black dot absolutely is. And if I had, I'm trying to look at this picture to see if I see any clear dots. They're called androcronial scales. They help in pheromone like scents. It's almost like them wearing a bit of a cologne. Males all have those, and it's always on the top of the orange on one of those black veins. And then the follow-up question to that was, do they always stay together? No. So what happens basically is because they're not reproducing while they're overwintering, the males and females, there's no copulation happening, there's no reproduction, there's no courtship, there's nothing happening. However, late in the season, so late in their migratory period, meaning like in February, like late February and in March, what you'll notice is that males will start beginning reproducing with females. They go through this little flighty courtship behavior where they kind of, follow the female and they fly around in a circle, and it's a very brief courtship, but nevertheless it works. And then they will mate, but once they do mate, they do not stay with the female. The males will actually try to mate a few different times just to up their chances of passing on their genes, but once the deed is done, they go their separate ways.
Okay. How many tagged monarchs are recovered in a normal year?
Oh, great question. Yeah. In an hour-long presentation, I could probably do a whole semester on this. I didn't even talk about tagging other than that quick reference to Dr. Urquhart back in the day. The tagging program now that's quite robust is with monarchwatch.org. So again, on that previous slide, and maybe what I'll do is I'll just go back to that slide. So if you want to jot any notes down, folks, Monarch Watch sells tags. The latest figure I heard is that the number of tags that are purchased or put on butterflies in North America, usually by school children, is about 20 to 30,000 a year. The number of recovered tags is probably in more of the hundreds. So it's a small percentage of tags that are found. However, having done this tagging and understanding and having participated in the science of understanding their route, every tag that's found is worth its weight in gold. Even though we don't find all 20,000 tags, even if we only find 100 tags, that's telling us just droves of important information. Like one big unanswered question is, those butterflies that start their migration, let's say in Kentucky, that's where that population was born, that monarch was born in Kentucky. Does it migrate down to Mexico, and do Kentucky butterflies always go to the same colony? Like, does it always go to the El Rosario colony or the Sierra Chinqua colony? And that's something we just don't know. And the best way to find that out is through tagging. So it's still a very, very important thing. But yeah, again, about 20,000 tags put on butterflies, probably 100 or two recovered each season.
Okay. I have a couple of milkweed questions that I'm going to combine for you. We have one from Avery, age 7. She wants to know what milkweed should be planted in the Washington, D.C. area. And then we have Catherine with us who would like to know, other than milkweed, are there other plants that monarchs like?
Great. Well, I'll answer the easy one first. There are no other plants that monarchs will use to eat, to physically eat the leaves of. So again, all butterflies need two different kinds of plants. They need a plant for their caterpillars that the caterpillars eat, and they also need nectar plants that the adults can feed off of. So monarchs will feed as adults on any nectar source. You can plant anything. I suggest a general butterfly bush. That's where you can go to the local garden store and say, hey, what are the best nectar sources you have? Get anything you want and plant it in your backyard, and that's fantastic. But that's for the adults. More importantly, it's the milkweed that's the limiting factor. So at the end of the day, don't worry too much about nailing that perfect species of milkweed for your area. If that's gonna be, what I call the barrier to entry, if it's too difficult and you just say, I'm not gonna do it, I give up, get any milkweed. Any milkweed's fine. But if you want to be, a perfectionist about it, it does help the butterflies. And frankly, I have not memorized the chart. There are, dozens of ornamental milkweeds, and there are over 100 milkweed species. So I don't know off the top of my head for the Washington, D.C. area. If I had to take a guess, it would be, I only know it by the scientific name, it'd be Asclepias tuberosa or Asclepias incarnata. I don't know off the top of my head. However, if you go right this very second to monarchwatch.org, they have maps, they have great resources. Monarchwatch.org is the definitive resource on that.
Okay, good. Thanks. Do monarchs add to their energy stores while they are in Mexico, or do they just conserve enough while they're there in order to begin the migration back?
Great question. Conserve all the way. It's estimated that about 5% of monarchs will actually feed when down in Mexico. There are some flowers, but not nearly enough to sustain a population. So in essence, they do not feed while down there. So they're entirely relying on the food they're able to eat on that southward journey. But here's an interesting part is that they actually will, in some cases, add 50%, maybe even 100% to their overall body mass because they do gorge themselves on the way down. If you think of what August and September are like, as a butterfly flies from, let's say, Ohio, down into the southeast and kind of along the Gulf of Mexico to the west, that's the summer thunderstorm time, right? August, that's when we're getting a lot of heavy rains. We're getting a lot of flowers that are replenished constantly with nectar. So they actually have a really, really, really great resource to tank up on food. I think it's all part of the equation. It's all the reason that this works.
Hmm. Okay. I'm just amazed at how many students, and I love how many students we have on with their parents today. Isaac, age 12, would like to know, how do you tag a monarch and how much do the tags weigh?
Oh, fantastic. Well, yeah, great question. So Monarch Watch is getting a lot of endorsements from me today. So they do sell the tags. It's kind of like a donation. I think you can get a sheet of maybe like 10 or 20 tags for 10 or $20. Absolutely worth getting them. Um, what you do is you would either raise your own monarchs, which is kind of time intensive. It's not the easiest thing to do. The other option is to go out and capture wild monarchs. Go to a website like bioquip.com, BIOQUIP.com, and buy yourself a butterfly net. Again, $15, $20, and have a nice Saturday or Sunday afternoon in a prairie or an area where you see butterflies. You capture monarch butterflies safely. There are instructions of how to do this in other resources, and you actually depress the tag. You press it's an adhesive, it's a sticky tag on the hind wing of the butterfly. The adhesive and the tag contains a serial code, kind of like a license plate, an email, and a phone number. So what happens is you take that tag, it says 4H1QRS or something like that, and you go on to the Monarch Watch website and you enter that number and you say where you put that tag on. So maybe you're in Kansas, maybe you're in Virginia, maybe you're in your New Jersey, New York, and you say, and that's the origin point. And so that gives us the first data point. And then when it's recovered, maybe it's recovered by another person that's trying to capture wild monarchs to put their own tags on. Maybe it's captured in Kentucky. Maybe it's captured in Georgia. That next data point is equally as valuable because now we understand that that butterfly flew in a very, very specific direction. Finding out that it flew along the coast or finding out that it flew directly west and then south, these are all super valuable things because until we can find a way to put a GPS collar on a monarch butterfly, it's really hard to track these things. Now that gets us to the second point that you made in a super smart question here is, what do the tags weigh? Well, the thing is that if these tags are to work and you're to study a monarch's behavior as natural behavior, they need to not impede the butterfly. They need to not weigh much. They need to not do anything because of the adhesive. So I don't know exactly what they weigh, but it's a fraction of what the monarch butterfly weighs. And in tests, they've done simulator tests and flight tests with monarchs with tags and without tags, and they've seen no change to natural flying ability.
All right, good.
And actually, you
Okay,
know
I think
what?
I'll ask. Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I have one thing to add here. If you look at the slide here with the monarch butterfly, you see how at the bottom of the orange wing, you see those two little black lobes? See how they're just like kind of like a little black sesame seed on just the very bottom. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but these things right here, that's the endocrinial scales. That's what designates it as a male.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I just noticed that.
All right. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll ask you a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. We have a lot that we'll forward along afterwards.
Okay.
Parker and Lauren in Houston, Texas are wondering, how long does it take them to fly to their destination in Mexico? How far can they fly each day?
Yeah, great question. So they fly on average about 200 miles a day. They often ride on thermals, so they're not beating their wings the whole time. Remember, I said they're super efficient flyers. So they're kind of like a hang glider. So they fly in some cases, like, in the clouds or maybe even above the clouds. We've documented them. So about 200 miles a day. And generally, we're talking about, a month or two to get down there. Obviously, those butterflies that are starting in Louisiana get there faster, or maybe they depart later. They're actually on the wing, they're flying less than those butterflies flying from Toronto. So I'd say between 1 and 2 months generally. Typically what we look at is butterflies starting to depart around August, September, late September, And then the first ones will usually start arriving by the end of October, and not coincidentally, right around the Day of the Dead in Mexico, in the Angungueo area. And you'll notice if you've ever been to a Day of the Dead celebration, monarch butterflies are a very common theme because they've been arriving in Mexico around that day, presumably for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, here's my last question for you, Court, and then we'll collect the rest. So the last question is ecotourism in Mexico beneficial to the monarchs?
Hugely beneficial. Oh gosh, do we have another 2 hours for presentation? Yeah, this is my dissertation in a nutshell. So simply put, I won't take another 2 hours. Uh, what ecotourism does is it creates financial incentive for local people to conserve their environment. And what that does, in a lot of these places, you can't tell someone that they can't put food on their table. They need to take care of their family. They need to earn an income. And unfortunately, a lot of ways, the easiest way to earn an income is to go cut down a tree. That's their natural resource. Cut down a tree, sell it to a lumber plant, and it gets turned into furniture. And it's hard to tell people, hey, don't cut down that tree because we want to see pretty butterflies. That's the last thing you can do. I mean, that's not good practice. So what we're doing with ecotourism is we're giving a better, more long-term, more profitable way to earn an income. So you cut down a tree and you earn $100. Yet ecotourism down in Mexico, spread amongst a 10,000 persons community, might give everybody more or less the equivalent of like several $100s a year, because people are working in restaurants, people are working in hotels, people are becoming naturalist guides, people are photographers, people are driving the vehicles and the buses, people are taking the entrance tickets. And so what it does is it provides all these jobs for people that otherwise would have really nothing to do but to create more farmland and to cut down more trees. So ecotourism, by adding value to natural areas, is a huge conservation tactic for not just monarch butterflies, but really the entire planet. It's why I do what I do. I think it's our most valuable way to conserve natural areas, is to add value to them via tourism dollars.
Thank you. I want to read a comment and then I'll turn it over to you for final comments. This is from one of our listeners, Norwood. He writes, this is more of a comment, inspiring and encouraging presentation. I was one of those citizen scientists as a research associate in Dr. Urquhart's program and started as a little boy in the 1960s. I was in New Hampshire. I continued tagging well into my early adulthood. Dr. Urquhart was a very kind and generous person to me as we had correspondence over the years. I had one butterfly that I tagged in New Hampshire was found in Mississippi. Monarchs still mean the world to me over the course of 55 plus years, and I'm happy to say that last season in my part of New Hampshire was the best in decades. It was amazing. So I love how we've been brought together today through Monarchs, Court. Thank you
That
so
is
much for
absolutely
being with us.
amazing. Yeah,
Yes, I love it.
and you hit the nail on the head. I mean, what a way to come together. I mean, we need this togetherness now more than ever, but let's keep this going. Let's keep the conversation going. I think one of the most valuable things we can all do if we like monarchs, if you are inspired by this presentation, is help me save them. Tell the story, tell others what you heard, send a recording of this webinar to others to let them know that there's a really cool part of science out there that is still not totally discovered by the general population, by general people. So I think the more we have this in our minds, the better the monarchs are going to do. And hopefully you've enjoyed the presentation. Hopefully you've learned a couple of things. And I'm sure I'll be getting to some of those questions that we weren't able to answer live here today. And I look forward to corresponding. Well, thanks so much, guys.
My thanks as well. We will get that replay out to you. Look for it in your inbox by about this time tomorrow. And just a little spoiler alert, we're going to be doing more of these, many more of these. So please watch for your email, and you will be invited to join us for many different topics. And we are just really looking forward to connecting with all of you. So with that, we will say good day and conclude our presentation. Goodbye, everybody.